What if the outcome of the greatest battle in human history was sealed before a single shot was fired? What if the decisions made in Berlin in the summer of 1942 in the corridors of the Wehrmacht High Command and in the mind of Adolf Hitler himself had already written the fate of more than 300,000 German soldiers? The Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as the turning point of the Second World War, a catastrophic defeat that broke the spine of the German military machine and set the Thousand Year Reich on its inexorable path to ruin. But for decades, historians have asked a haunting question. Was the disaster at Stalingrad a tragedy of circumstance, a result of bad luck and unforeseen Soviet resilience? Or was it, from the very beginning, a catastrophe waiting to happen, the product of strategic arrogance, fatal miscalculations, a commander who could not say no, and a dictator who could not accept reality? In this video, we are going to find out. We are going to peel back every layer of the Stalingrad story, examining the decisions, the personalities, the logistical nightmares, the intelligence failures, and the sheer hubris that made Germany's greatest military defeat not just possible, but inevitable. So, without further ado, let's start from the very beginning. To understand why Stalingrad was doomed, we first need to understand what Germany was actually trying to accomplish in the summer of 1942. The previous year had been a rude awakening. Operation Barbarossa, the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, had been launched with the expectation that the Soviet state would collapse like a house of cards. Hitler had famously said that all they needed to do was kick in the rotten door and the whole edifice would come tumbling down. For a while, it seemed like he might be right. The Wehrmacht drove deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners in battles at Kiev, Vyazma, and Bryansk. But then, as autumn turned to winter, the German advance slowed and finally halted. The Red Army, which the Germans had so contemptuously underestimated, refused to die. And in December 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive that drove the Germans back from the gates of Moscow and shattered the myth of German invincibility. By the spring of 1942, Germany faced a strategic crisis. The quick war they had planned for had not materialized. The Soviet Union, despite its staggering losses, was still fighting, and Germany was running out of the one resource it desperately needed to keep fighting: oil. This energy crisis would be the engine that drove every subsequent decision, including the decisions that led directly to the catastrophe at Stalingrad. When the German military began planning for the 1942 summer offensive, the central strategic objective was clear, at least in the minds of the generals: Germany needed oil. The oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly around Baku on the Caspian Sea, were producing roughly 90% of Soviet fuel. If Germany could capture those fields, it would simultaneously cripple the Soviet war machine and solve its own fuel shortages. The plan that emerged was called Operation Blue, or Fall Blau in German, and it was built around this single compelling strategic logic. Army Group South would drive eastward and then southward, sweeping across the southern Russian steppe, crossing the Volga River or cutting it to traffic, and then plunging into the Caucasus to seize the oil. Stalingrad, at this stage, was not the primary objective. It was a geographic convenience, a city sitting on the Great Bend of the Volga that would serve as a hinge point for the offensive, protecting the northern flank of the drive south. The city itself, in the original conception of Fall Blau, was to be neutralized through artillery bombardment and air attack, not necessarily captured street by street. But that original conception would not survive contact with Adolf Hitler's strategic imagination, and this divergence between military logic and political obsession would be the first of many factors that doomed the German campaign before it had properly begun. The name mattered. In the summer of 1942, the city on the Volga was officially known as Stalingrad, Stalin's city. It had been renamed in 1925 after the Soviet dictator who had played a significant military role there during the Russian Civil War. For Hitler, a man for whom symbolic warfare was as important as military reality, the capture of a city bearing Stalin's name carried an almost mystical significance. Conversely, for Stalin, the idea of the Germans capturing a city that bore his name was politically and personally intolerable. This clash of egos of two dictators for whom the battle would become a matter of personal prestige before it was a matter of military logic would transform what was meant to be a supporting operation into the most costly engagement in the history of warfare. But in the early summer of 1942, none of this was yet apparent. The Wehrmacht was in good spirits. After the difficult winter of 1941 to 1942, the spring had brought renewed confidence. New panzer units had been refitted and re-equipped. Experienced commanders were in place. The Soviets, battered and overextended by their winter counteroffensives, seemed vulnerable. When Fall Blau was launched in late June 1942, the initial results seemed to confirm German optimism. The campaign opened on June 28, 1942, when Army Group South launched its offensive on a wide front from Kursk to Taganrog. The initial results were startling in their success. Soviet forces retreated rapidly, sometimes in disorder, falling back across the open steppe to avoid the encirclements that had destroyed so many of their armies the previous year. The Wehrmacht advanced with stunning speed, covering hundreds of kilometers in just a few weeks. Towns and cities fell. The Don River was crossed. German soldiers gazed out across the seemingly endless Russian steppe and allowed themselves to believe again that the enemy was broken. But already, beneath this surface of success, the seeds of disaster were being planted. The Soviets were not breaking. They were retreating, yes, but they were retreating in good order, preserving their forces for the battles to come. And as the Germans advanced, they were stretching their supply lines to the breaking point, sending their armies deeper and deeper into territory where every kilometre of advance made the logistical challenge more difficult. In those early weeks of triumph, it was easy to ignore these gathering problems. In the months that followed, they would become impossible to escape. On July 23, 1942, Adolf Hitler issued Directive No. 45, and this document, more than any other single decision, set Germany on the path to catastrophe. The directive represented a fundamental change in the strategic concept of Fall Blau. Originally, the plan had called for a sequential approach. First, Army Group South would secure the Don-Volga corridor and capture or neutralize Stalingrad, and only then would the main armoured forces push south into the Caucasus. This sequence made military sense because it preserved the principle of concentration, keeping German forces strong enough at any given point to achieve their objectives. But Directive No. 45 abandoned this sequential logic and replaced it with something far more dangerous. Hitler now ordered both objectives to be pursued simultaneously. Army Group South was split into two parts. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, would drive south into the Caucasus to capture the oil fields. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, would drive east to capture Stalingrad and cover the northern flank. In theory, the two army groups would support each other. In practice, they would be pulling in opposite directions across an enormous front with insufficient forces for either mission. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German Army General Staff, was appalled. He noted in his diary that Hitler was irretrievably committed to a catastrophic path. He was right, but nobody listened. The division of Army Group South was not just a strategic blunder in the abstract, it had immediate and devastating practical consequences. The German forces available for each of the two major objectives were now dramatically weakened. Army Group B, tasked with the capture of Stalingrad, was built around the 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, along with the 4th Panzer Army. But the flanks of this advance, stretching for hundreds of kilometres along the Don River, could not possibly be covered by German forces alone. Germany simply did not have enough men. To fill this gap, the Wehrmacht relied on its allies, the 2nd Hungarian Army, the 8th Italian Army and the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies. These Allied formations were equipped with lighter weapons, fewer anti-tank guns, and lower levels of training compared to their German counterparts. More critically, they lacked the equipment and doctrine to deal with the kind of armoured breakthrough that Soviet commanders were already planning. Thousands of kilometres of front line held by armies that were in many respects fighting the war with the tools and techniques of a previous generation. This was the framework upon which the fate of the 6th Army would ultimately rest, and it was a framework that any competent military analyst could have identified as catastrophically fragile. The Soviets, as we shall see, needed no prompting to identify exactly this weakness. The logistical situation that confronted the German forces advancing towards Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 was, to put it simply, a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The distances involved were staggering. The nearest major railhead to Stalingrad was at Milerovo, more than 500 kilometres away. Every litre of fuel, every artillery shell, every loaf of bread, every spare part for the tanks and trucks and half-tracks had to travel this enormous distance through a transport system that was already under enormous strain. The Soviet Union's rail network used a broader gauge than the European standard, which meant that every captured railway line had to be converted before it could carry German rolling stock. This was slow, labour-intensive work, and it meant that the railway capacity available to the German forces was always below what military planners had calculated they needed. The result was that the German forces advancing on Stalingrad often found themselves running short of fuel at critical moments, their tanks forced to halt not because of Soviet resistance, but because they had consumed every drop of petrol in their fuel tanks, and the resupply had not arrived. This problem was not new. It had plagued Barbarossa the previous year, but the distances were now even greater, the demands even higher, and the available transport even more overstretched. When critics of the Stalingrad campaign point to logistical failure as one of the primary reasons the battle was doomed, they are identifying something real and profound. An army that cannot feed itself, that cannot fuel its vehicles, that cannot supply its artillery, is an army that cannot win, regardless of the courage and skill of its individual soldiers. Who was the man sent to capture Stalingrad? Friedrich Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, in Breitenau, in the Hesse-Nassau province of what was then the German Empire. He came from a relatively modest middle-class family, his father a treasury official, and he had worked hard throughout his military career to overcome the social disadvantages that came from not being born into the Prussian military aristocracy that dominated the upper echelons of the German army. Paulus was intelligent, meticulous, and extraordinarily precise in his work habits. His uniform was always immaculate, his staff work impeccable, his reports perfectly organised. He was widely regarded as one of the most talented staff officers in the German military, and he had risen rapidly through the ranks on the strength of these qualities. During the planning phase of Operation Barbarossa, he had served as the first quartermaster general, essentially the number 2 man in the Army High Command, and he had contributed significantly to the operational planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He was the model of a German staff officer, brilliant, hard-working, loyal, and deeply committed to the principles of the military hierarchy. But it was precisely these qualities, so admirable in a staff officer, that would make him disastrously unsuited for the role he was now asked to play. A commander in the field needs to be able to make rapid, independent decisions, sometimes in direct contradiction to orders from above when circumstances demand it. He needs to be willing to accept personal responsibility for decisions that might fail, and push back against superiors when their orders conflict with the military realities on the ground. He needs, in short, a kind of moral courage that is quite different from physical bravery. Paulus had physical courage in abundance. He repeatedly exposed himself to danger on the front lines, but he lacked the moral courage to defy Hitler. This was not a unique failing. Many German commanders shared it, but in Paulus's case it would prove fatal, not just for himself, but for the 300,000 men under his command. When Paulus was appointed commander of the 6th Army in January 1942, he had never held an independent field command of comparable size. He had commanded a corps briefly during the invasion of the Soviet Union, but that experience was limited. Now he found himself in command of the largest single army in the entire German order of battle, a force of eventually more than 20 divisions with hundreds of thousands of men. And he was asked to lead this force into what would become the most intense urban battle in the history of warfare, against an enemy fighting with desperate determination to defend a city that bore their leader's name. Was Friedrich Paulus, the meticulous staff officer, the right man for this job? The answer, sadly, was almost certainly no. Paulus arrived at Stalingrad with the 6th Army in late August 1942, his forces having pushed across the Don River and advanced rapidly across the open steppe. The city itself stretched for more than 50 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River. It was not a conventional urban area of compact blocks and right-angle streets, but rather a sprawling industrial conurbation, dominated by 3 enormous factory complexes: the tractor factory, the Barricadi Ordnance Factory, and the Red October Steelworks. Between these factory districts ran residential areas of wooden houses, ravines called balkas, hills and gullies that broke up the terrain and made the movement of armoured vehicles extraordinarily difficult. The Volga itself, flowing behind the city, was more than a kilometre wide at this point, a formidable natural barrier that simultaneously prevented the Soviet defenders from retreating and provided, however precariously, a supply route across which ammunition, food and reinforcements could be ferried at night under German fire. It was a city built for defence, though not by design. Its geography, its industries, its position on the Volga, all of these things combined to create a battlefield that would systematically nullify Germany's greatest advantages in mobility and firepower while magnifying Soviet strengths in infantry combat and close quarters fighting. The German army had been designed for and had succeeded in a war of rapid maneuver. Stalingrad would demand something entirely different. The initial German assault on the city began on August 23, 1942, with a massive air raid by the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, commanded by General Wolfram von Richthofen. More than 600 aircraft participated in waves of bombing that reduced much of the city's residential districts to rubble. The fires burned for days. The Volga itself seemed to burn as oil storage tanks ruptured and flaming oil spread across the river's surface. Tens of thousands of civilians who had not been evacuated died in this initial bombardment. The destruction was immense and immediate, but here was the paradox that German planners had failed to anticipate. The rubble created by the bombing made Stalingrad not easier but harder to capture. The mountains of broken masonry and twisted metal, the collapsed buildings that created fortresses of debris, the craters that channeled movement and provided hiding places, all of these things turned every block, every street, every building into a separate battle. The kind of broad operational sweeps that the Wehrmacht excelled at were simply impossible in this environment. You could not outflank a ruined factory. You had to go through it, room by room, floor by floor, cellar by cellar, in the most brutal and costly kind of fighting imaginable. It was a form of warfare sometimes called Rattenkrieg by the Germans, rat war, and it was a form of warfare in which all of Germany's strategic and tactical advantages counted for almost nothing. Into this inferno came Vasily Chuikov. On September 12, 1942, Lieutenant General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov was given command of the Soviet 62nd Army, the formation responsible for the direct defense of Stalingrad. He was 42 years old, rough-mannered, sometimes brutal, absolutely determined, and possessed of a tactical genius that would prove perfectly suited to the demands of the battle. Chuikov looked at the problem of defending Stalingrad against a superior enemy and arrived at a counterintuitive solution. The standard Soviet military doctrine called for defense in depth, with positions spread over a wide area to absorb enemy attacks. Chuikov threw this out. He ordered his troops to close with the Germans, to fight at ranges so close that the Luftwaffe and the German artillery could not be brought to bear without hitting their own men. He called this tactic hugging the enemy, and it was brutally effective. Soviet soldiers were ordered to hold positions within grenade-throwing range of the Germans, sometimes within a few meters. The fighting in Stalingrad became so intimate, so desperate and close quarters that individual buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. The Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that dominated the city, changed hands so many times that its surface was stripped bare of all vegetation. After the war, when workers broke the ground to begin reconstruction, they found that the soil itself had been replaced by a layer of metal, shrapnel and shell fragments packed so densely together that the hill had effectively been armoured. Chuikov also understood the importance of what would come to be called the storm group tactic. Rather than attacking in large formations that German firepower could destroy in the open, Soviet soldiers were organized into small teams of 8 to 10 men, each group carrying a mix of weapons, demolition charges, flamethrowers, machine guns, and automatic rifles. These storm groups would infiltrate German positions under cover of darkness, attacking from unexpected directions, using sewers and rubble-strewn passages to move through the city. They would seize a building, fortify it, and force the Germans to attack them in exactly the kind of costly frontal assault that the Soviets were enduring daily. This approach transformed the battle into something the German army had never fully prepared for, a grinding war of attrition fought at the most personal and brutal level imaginable, where the courage and resourcefulness of individual soldiers mattered more than operational genius or technological superiority. The Germans were winning ground, yes, slowly, painfully and at enormous cost, but they were also bleeding and the blood they were losing was irreplaceable. By October and November of 1942, the Sixth Army had pushed the 62nd Army back to a narrow strip along the Volga bank. At some points, the Soviet positions were only a few hundred meters deep, pressed up against the river with no room to retreat. German soldiers stood on the bank of the Volga itself and could see the eastern shore. Victory seemed close enough to touch, but it remained elusive, always just beyond reach, as Chuikov's troops continued to resist with a tenacity that defied all rational calculation. The losses on both sides were catastrophic. The Sixth Army was losing thousands of men every week, experienced veterans who could not be quickly replaced. German divisions that had entered the city with thousands of men were now skeletal formations numbering in the hundreds. And all the while, as the brutal urban fighting consumed Germany's finest soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad, something far more dangerous was being prepared in the Soviet rear. The man who understood what was coming, who saw with terrifying clarity the strategic opportunity that Germany's overextension had created, was General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Born in 1896 in a small village in the Kaluga region, Zhukov had served as a cavalry NCO in the First World War and had remained in the Red Army through the upheavals of the Russian Civil War and the purges of the 1930s that had decimated the Soviet officer corps. He had demonstrated his talents dramatically in 1939 when he commanded Soviet forces in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol against Japan, inflicting a decisive defeat that convinced Tokyo to avoid further conflict with the Soviet Union. He had proved his worth again during the crisis of 1941, playing a key role in organizing the Alwa defense of Moscow and then the counteroffensive that drove the Germans back. By 1942, Zhukov was the Stavka's, the Soviet Supreme Command's, most trusted operational commander, and it was to Zhukov, along with Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky, that Stalin turned in September 1942 with a question that would determine the outcome of the entire war. How do we not just hold Stalingrad, but destroy the German forces there? Zhukov and Vasilevsky spent weeks studying the situation, traveling secretly to the front to assess conditions firsthand, examining intelligence reports, aerial photographs, prisoner interrogations, and signals intercepts. What they saw confirmed a strategic opportunity of historic proportions. The German Sixth Army and elements of the Fourth Panzer Army were concentrated in and around Stalingrad, fighting in the city. But north and south of the city, stretched along hundreds of kilometers of Don River front, were the Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies, the weakest elements of the entire German-led coalition. These Allied formations held their positions with inadequate artillery support, insufficient anti-tank weapons, and troops whose morale, already shaky, was deteriorating as the Russian autumn turned toward winter. Zhukov and Vasilevsky recognized that these flanks were not just weak, they were catastrophically vulnerable. A sufficiently powerful armoured thrust on both flanks simultaneously could break through these Allied lines, sweep around behind Stalingrad, and encircle the entire Sixth Army in the city. It was, in essence, the same manoeuvre that the Germans themselves had used to such devastating effect in their encirclement battles of 1941, turned now against them by commanders who had learned from bitter experience how it was done. The plan was given the code name Operation Uranus, and its execution would require a level of secrecy and preparation that the Soviet command applied with extraordinary discipline. Throughout October and into November of 1942, the Soviets moved men, tanks, and artillery to the areas north and south of Stalingrad, carefully concealing this build-up from German observation. Entire tank armies were repositioned under the cover of darkness, with radio silence strictly enforced to prevent interception. Supply dumps were stockpiled. Crossing points over the Don were prepared. By November, the Soviets had assembled on the northern flank alone more than 300,000 soldiers, 900 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. On the southern flank, a similar concentration was building around Lake Sarpa. The Germans knew something was happening. Aerial reconnaissance showed increased Soviet activity. Intelligence reports spoke of large concentrations of men and armor. But the information was filtered through a Wehrmacht intelligence apparatus that had systematically underestimated Soviet capabilities since the beginning of the war, and it reached commanders, whose confidence in their own positions blinded them to the danger. General Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as chief of the German Army General Staff in September 1942, did raise concerns about the vulnerability of the flanks. Some local commanders, particularly General Petre Dumitrescu of the Romanian Third Army on the northern flank, repeatedly warned that his forces could not withstand a major Soviet armoured assault. Their warnings were noted, acknowledged, and ignored. And so the trap was set, the jaw of the vice was open, and the Sixth Army was walking deeper into it with every passing day. On November 19th, 1942, at 5:30 in the morning, a sound like the end of the world shook the frozen steppe north of Stalingrad. More than 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously along a front stretching for some 90 kilometers, and the pre-dawn darkness was replaced by a continuous flickering wall of flame. The temperature was -18 degrees Celsius. The ground was iron-hard with frost, a blizzard was reducing visibility to near zero, and the soldiers of the Romanian Third Army, huddled in their trenches and dugouts, suddenly found themselves at the centre of the most concentrated artillery bombardment they had ever experienced or imagined. The barrage lasted for 80 minutes. When it lifted, 3 Soviet tank armies comprising more than 500 tanks rolled forward through the smoke and the snow, smashing through positions that had been flattened by the guns. The Romanian soldiers, armed largely with rifles and light machine guns, their few anti-tank weapons already destroyed, could do almost nothing. Some units fought with great bravery, dying where they stood. Others, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the assault, broke and fled. Within hours, the northern arm of the Soviet pincer had torn a gap 40 kilometers wide in the German-Romanian front, and Soviet armor was pouring through it, heading south and east at maximum speed, racing to close the trap around Stalingrad. The following day, November 20th, the southern pincer struck. Soviet forces of the 51st and 57th Armies attacked the Romanian 4th Army positions south and southwest of Stalingrad. Once again, the weight of Soviet armor and artillery proved devastating against the outgunned Allied formations. The Romanians on this flank, like their comrades to the north, were simply unable to resist the force directed against them. Within 24 hours, the southern Soviet armoured columns were driving northwest to meet their counterparts coming south. On November 23, 1942, the two pincers met at the town of Kalash on the Don River. The encirclement was complete. Inside the newly formed pocket, cut off from all land communication with the rest of the German forces, were the entire 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, amounting to somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 German, Romanian and Croatian soldiers. In the space of 4 days, one of the greatest feats of arms in the history of the German military had been turned into a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions. And the question that would dominate German military planning for the next 2 months, was simple. What could be done to save them? Inside the pocket, the reaction to the encirclement was initially one of stunned disbelief. German soldiers had grown so accustomed to being on the offensive, to encircling Soviet armies rather than being encircled, that many could not immediately process what had happened. Officers at every level scrambled to make sense of the situation. Communication with the rear had been cut. Supply routes were severed. The ammunition and food stocks inside the pocket were limited. Paulus, confronting what was perhaps the worst military situation in German history, now faced the most important decision of his career, and probably of his life. He had to decide whether to obey Hitler's orders to hold the city or to act on his own military judgment and attempt to break out of the encirclement before the Soviets could consolidate their lines and make escape impossible. In the first days after the encirclement, a breakout was genuinely possible. The Soviet ring was thin, the forces holding it were not yet fully organised, and the 6th Army, though encircled, still possessed substantial armoured strength. Several of Paulus's senior commanders urged him to act immediately, to begin moving west without waiting for Hitler's authorisation. General Arthur Schmidt, the 6th Army's Chief of Staff, argued against a breakout. He believed, as Paulus himself was beginning to believe, that an airlift could sustain the army inside the pocket while a relief force was assembled to break through from outside. The airlift. This was the promise that would seal the 6th Army's fate. On November 24, 1942, Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, and one of Hitler's oldest and most trusted associates, made a commitment that he could not possibly keep. He told Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled 6th Army from the air, delivering sufficient quantities of food, ammunition and fuel to keep the army combat effective until a relief operation could open a ground corridor. The minimum daily requirement calculated by 6th Army logisticians was 550 tons per day. This was a massive figure, representing an airlift operation of a scale that had never been attempted in any theatre of the war. Goering's staff officers knew immediately that the figure was unreachable. The Luftwaffe simply did not have enough transport aircraft. Even under ideal conditions, operating in summer with no Soviet air opposition, the best the available fleet of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes could deliver was perhaps 300 tons per day. In the Russian winter, with Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns threatening, every flight with airfields in terrible condition and ground crews struggling to keep aircraft operational in temperatures that could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, the realistic delivery rate was far lower still. General Hans Jaschonek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, reportedly calculated that achieving even half the required tonnage would be impossible. He was right. But Goering told Hitler it could be done, and Hitler, who desperately wanted to believe it, believed it. Why did Goering make a promise he knew to be impossible? The answer lies in the complex psychology of the Nazi leadership and Goering's particular position within it. By late 1942, Goering's standing with Hitler had declined significantly. The Luftwaffe's failure to prevent the Allied bombing of German cities, its inability to maintain air superiority over the Eastern Front, its disastrous performance during the Battle of Britain in 1940, when it had promised to destroy the Royal Air Force and failed, all of these things had eroded Hitler's confidence in his old comrade. Goering needed a triumph. He needed desperately to demonstrate that the Luftwaffe could deliver when it mattered most. And so he told Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear, and in doing so, condemned 300,000 men to death or captivity. It was one of the most consequential lies in the history of warfare. The airlift began on November 25, 1942, and from the very first day it fell catastrophically short of requirements. The aircraft available, a mix of Ju-52 transports, He-111 bombers converted for supply duties, and a small number of larger Fw-200 Condors, were simply inadequate for the task. On the best days, around 300 tons might be delivered. On most days, the figure was far lower. On bad days, with Soviet air defences active and the weather closed in, almost nothing reached the pocket. The average daily delivery over the entire airlift was around 100 tons, less than 20% of what the 6th Army needed to survive, let alone fight. The pilots and crews of the airlift flew with extraordinary courage, taking off from icy runways in aircraft that were often unheated and always vulnerable, flying through Soviet fighter interceptions and anti-aircraft fire to reach the pocket's airstrips at Pitomnik and later Gumrak. Many of them died, their aircraft shot down or crashing in terrible weather. The Luftwaffe lost more than 500 aircraft during the Stalingrad airlift, a devastating depletion of its transport capabilities that would affect German operations for months. But courage alone could not overcome the arithmetic of the situation. The 6th Army was receiving perhaps a fifth of what it needed. Soldiers began to go hungry, then to starve. Ammunition stocks dwindled, vehicles ran out of fuel and had to be abandoned. Horses, used to pull artillery pieces that could no longer be moved by trucks, were slaughtered for food. Men who a few months earlier had been fit, well-fed soldiers began to die of malnutrition and cold in the ruins of the city they had fought so hard to capture. The conditions inside the pocket deteriorated with terrifying speed, and the promise of the airlift, repeated endlessly by Hitler and his propagandists as a reassurance to the trapped men and their families at home, grew ever more hollow. While the airlift struggled, the German High Command was assembling the relief force that it hoped would break through to the encircled army. The man chosen to lead this operation was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, and the choice was a good one. Manstein was widely regarded as the most gifted operational commander in the German army, perhaps in any army fighting in the Second World War. Born Erich von Lewinsky on November 24, 1887 in Berlin, he had been adopted by his mother's childless brother-in-law Georg von Manstein and had taken the family name. He had served with distinction in the First World War and had risen steadily through the ranks of the Weimar Republic's small professional army. It was Manstein who had devised the bold plan to invade France through the Ardennes in 1940, a stroke of operational genius that had stunned the Allies and delivered France in 6 weeks. On the Eastern Front, he had captured Sevastopol in 1942, a feat for which he was promoted to Field Marshal, and he had commanded with great skill in difficult circumstances throughout the campaign. If anyone could rescue the Sixth Army, it was Manstein. But even Manstein's genius could not overcome the fundamental problems of the situation: insufficient forces, inadequate time, and an encircled army whose commander would not or could not act decisively to help itself. The relief operation was given the codename Operation Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter, and it was launched on December 12, 1942 by the newly created Army Group Don under Manstein's command. The primary strike force was the 57th Panzer Corps, comprising the 6th Panzer Division, recently arrived from France where it had been refitting, and two badly depleted armoured formations. The plan was to drive northeast from the area around Kotelnikovo, pushing through Soviet defences and fighting toward the encircled army. A second thrust was planned from the Chir River to the northwest, but this was repeatedly delayed and ultimately never properly launched because Soviet pressure kept the forces there occupied with their own defensive needs. The 57th Panzer Corps struck hard and made initial progress, crossing the Aksai River on December 13th and continuing northeast. But the going was difficult. The Soviets had been expecting a relief attempt and had positioned powerful armoured reserves to contest it. For every kilometre the Germans advanced, they fought costly battles against increasingly well-organised Soviet defensive lines. By December 19th, after a week of fighting, the spearhead of the relief force had reached the Mishkova River about 48 kilometres from the southern edge of the Stalingrad pocket. On clear nights, soldiers claimed they could see the gun flashes above Stalingrad. They were close. But were they close enough? At this point, Manstein faced a critical question that would ultimately determine the Sixth Army's fate. He needed Paulus to break out. He needed the Sixth Army to gather its remaining armoured strength, punch through the Soviet lines on the southern face of the pocket, and drive south to meet the relief force at the Mishkova River. This manoeuvre, codenamed Operation Thunderclap or Donnerschlag, had always been the planned second half of Winter Storm. Without it, the relief force could not reach Stalingrad. The distance was simply too great, the Soviet forces between them too strong, for the relief force to break all the way into the city without the encircled army fighting its way out to meet it. But there was a profound problem. Paulus would not act without explicit authorization from Hitler, and Hitler would not give it. Hitler was adamant that the Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad, that breaking out southward meant abandoning the city, and that abandoning the city was unacceptable. He was, at this point, conducting the campaign not as a military commander trying to preserve his forces, but as a politician, defending his prestige and his myth of infallibility. The Sixth Army must stay. It was a fortress. It was an immovable point of resistance around which future operations would be organized. The fact that the men inside the fortress were dying of cold and hunger, the fact that every day that passed made their position weaker and the Soviet ring stronger, none of this seemed to penetrate Hitler's increasingly detached strategic vision. Manstein sent a message to Paulus on December 19th, using the code phrase, "Thunderclap is imminent," to signal that the time had come to begin the breakout. Paulus replied that he needed Hitler's explicit authorization, and that he lacked sufficient fuel to break out, as his tanks had only enough petrol for approximately 30 kilometers of operations. This was a devastating admission. The airlift had failed so completely that the army lacked the fuel to save itself, even if ordered to try. But some historians have challenged the fuel argument, noting that Paulus had substantial fuel reserves allocated for internal movement within the pocket, and that a determined breakout could have been sustained for considerably more than 30 kilometers if the fuel had been redistributed accordingly. The truth is probably that Paulus used the fuel shortage as a practical argument to support a decision that he had already made on other grounds. He would not break out without Hitler's order, and Hitler would not give the order. It was a fatal paralysis, born of the peculiar psychology of the Nazi command system, in which obedience to the Führer's will had been elevated so far above independent military judgment, that even men whose lives depended on acting were unable to act. While Paulus waited for orders that would never come, the Soviets struck again. On December 16th, 3 days before the relief force reached the Mishkova River, the Red Army launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive directed not against Stalingrad itself but against the Italian 8th Army, holding the front along the middle Don River, more than 200 kilometers to the northwest. Little Saturn tore through the Italian positions with even greater violence than Uranus had torn through the Romanians. The Italian army, equipped with virtually no tanks and inadequate anti-tank guns, facing several Soviet armoured armies, simply disintegrated. Entire divisions were destroyed or scattered. The gap created in the German front was enormous, more than 200 kilometers wide and growing by the hour. Soviet armored columns poured through, driving southwest toward the German supply and airfield complex at Tatsinskaya. If the Soviets reached Tatsinskaya, they would destroy the main Luftwaffe base supporting the Stalingrad airlift, and the already inadequate air supply would collapse entirely. Manstein now faced an impossible dilemma. The forces he needed to support the winter storm relief drive were being pulled away to deal with the catastrophe on the Don. On December 23rd, Soviet tanks reached Tatsinskaya and overran the airfield. The aircraft there managed to escape only through a frantic emergency evacuation. But the facility was lost and the airlift was forced to operate from bases even further from the pocket, making an already nearly impossible task completely impossible. By Christmas Day 1942, the strategic situation had been transformed completely. The relief force at the Mishkova River, starved of reinforcements and under heavy Soviet pressure, could advance no further. Manstein ordered it to halt and begin fortifying its positions. The rescue of the Sixth Army was now no longer possible, not without resources that simply did not exist. The last realistic opportunity for survival had passed. Inside the pocket, soldiers spent Christmas in dugouts and ruined cellars, sharing out tiny portions of horse-meat bread and trying to remember what warmth felt like. Some units managed to organize Christmas services. There were small gifts distributed by officers who had somehow preserved packages from home. A few soldiers recorded in their diaries that they still believed rescue would come, that the Führer would not abandon them. Others, more clear-sighted, had already begun to understand that they were not going to leave Stalingrad alive. The propaganda broadcasts from German radio continued to speak of relief, of the armies fighting to reach them, of the Führer's unshakable determination to save his soldiers. The broadcasts were increasingly disconnected from reality, but they were all that many soldiers had to hold on to, and so they held on, and they starved, and froze and died while waiting for a rescue that was never going to come. The situation inside the Stalingrad pocket throughout January 1943 was one of progressive, accelerating catastrophe. The supply situation had reached a level of crisis that no military organization could long endure. The daily ration for German soldiers inside the pocket had been progressively reduced from the normal field ration of about 1,800 calories per day to approximately 500 calories. Soldiers were receiving about the same daily food as concentration camp inmates. The effects were devastating and swift. Men who had been strong and fit began to waste away. A doctor serving inside the pocket, later released after the war, recorded in his memoirs that by January, many soldiers had lost 30 or 40% of their body weight. Symptoms of severe malnutrition were widespread. Weakness, disorientation, swollen joints, skin infections that would not heal. In the terrible cold, which reached minus 40 degrees Celsius in January 1943, men whose bodies could no longer generate enough heat from their inadequate diet simply froze to death in their positions. Frostbite was ubiquitous. The military hospitals, overwhelmed from the start of the Encirclement, were now scenes of almost indescribable suffering, crowded with men who could not be treated, could not be evacuated, and knew they were dying. And the fighting continued. Even as the Sixth Army starved, Soviet forces were systematically compressing the pocket, attacking on all sides, grinding away at German positions through December and into January. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final offensive designed to destroy the encircled army. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Don Front, directed an assault with powerful armoured and infantry forces from the west, the side where the pocket was thinnest and the German defences most vulnerable. The attack was preceded by a massive artillery preparation, 8,000 guns and mortars opening fire simultaneously, the earth shaking for 100 kilometres in every direction. The German defenders, weak and hungry, lacking ammunition, unable to move their heavy equipment without fuel, nonetheless fought with extraordinary determination, contesting every position, launching counterattacks with formations that should by any calculation have been incapable of offensive action. But they could not hold. The pocket began to shrink day by day as Soviet forces pushed inward from all directions. The airfield at Pitomnik, the main landing strip through which the airlift had been delivering supplies and evacuating the most seriously wounded, fell to Soviet forces on January 16th. The final operational airfield at Gumrak fell on January 21st. After that, there was no more airlift, no more evacuation of the wounded, no more contact with the outside world except by radio. The Sixth Army was not just encircled. It was sealed, dying by inches with no prospect of relief and nowhere to go. The command structure inside the pocket was beginning to fracture under the unbearable strain. General Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, remained grimly committed to continued resistance, seemingly unable to accept that the situation was hopeless. Paulus himself was increasingly overwhelmed, suffering from a facial tic that developed under the stress, physically exhausted, psychologically hollowed out by the realization that he had led his army into destruction. He continued to send situation reports to Hitler that described with remarkable precision the catastrophic conditions inside the pocket: the starvation, the ammunition shortages, the impossibility of continued resistance. Hitler read these reports and responded with orders to hold, with promises of relief that everyone knew could not be fulfilled, and with extraordinary promotions. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The promotion was understood immediately for what it was. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. By promoting Paulus on the eve of the end, Hitler was sending him a message: either die in the ruins of Stalingrad, your body a symbol of resistance to the last, or be the first Field Marshal in German history to capitulate to the enemy. It was a message about prestige and propaganda, and it told Paulus, more clearly than any explicit instruction, what his Führer expected of him. The following day, January 31st, 1943, the southern pocket of the Encirclement collapsed. Soviet forces entered the basement of the Central Department Store building in the central city, where Paulus had established his final headquarters, and the Field Marshal surrendered. He was found by Soviet soldiers in a disheveled state, unshaven, his face showing the exhaustion and strain of weeks of slow defeat. He presented his identity documents and submitted to capture. The last German field marshal to be taken prisoner by the enemy in the First World War had been treated by the conventions of that conflict with considerable courtesy. Paulus could not know what treatment awaited him as a prisoner of the Soviet Union, a nation that the Wehrmacht had invaded with instructions to wage a war of annihilation. But he had made his choice. He would not die in the basement. He would live, and in living, he would face the consequences of everything that had brought the Sixth Army to this end. He was the first German field marshal ever to surrender to an enemy, and the news, when it broke through German propaganda filters to reach the people at home, was received with something approaching shock. The myth of German invincibility, the legend of the undefeatable Wehrmacht, had been broken in the ruins of a city on the Volga. The northern pocket, under the command of General Karl Strecker, held out for 2 more days. Strecker, a soldier of the old school who understood that further resistance was pointless, but felt bound by duty to continue until his men could no longer physically fight, finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943. With his surrender, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The German Sixth Army, once the most powerful single army in the German order of battle, the force that had captured Paris and driven to the gates of Moscow, had ceased to exist as a military formation. Of the roughly 260,000 men who had been encircled in November, approximately 90,000 were taken prisoner at the end. The rest had died during the encirclement, killed in combat or dead from starvation, cold, disease, and wounds. The 90,000 prisoners began their march into captivity, a march that for most of them would lead to Soviet prisoner of war camps from which they would never return. Of the approximately 90,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet captivity, mostly within the first year, as the deprivations of the pocket gave way to the equally brutal conditions of the Soviet camp system. To understand why Stalingrad was doomed from the start, it is not enough to tell the story of what happened. We must dig deeper into the specific decisions and the specific failures that made catastrophe inevitable, and we must examine the lives and fates of the men who made those decisions, because their stories reveal the human reality behind the strategic calculations. Let us begin with the man at the center of everything, Friedrich Paulus himself, and the extraordinary question of whether, had a different man commanded the Sixth Army, the outcome might have been different. Friedrich Paulus surrendered on January 31st, 1943, and his surrender created a storm of controversy in Germany and among the German officer corps that has never fully subsided. His critics, both during the war and in the historical literature, since have argued that he had multiple opportunities to save his army, or at least to give it a fighting chance of survival, and that he failed to take any of them because of an inability to act independently of Hitler's will. The most damning criticism concerns the breakout. In the days immediately following the encirclement, from November 23rd to approximately December 1st, 1942, the Soviet ring around Stalingrad was thin and poorly organized. Soviet forces had moved fast and covered enormous distances, and the supply and communication systems needed to support a solid defensive encirclement had not yet been fully established. Experienced commanders who were present at the time, men like General Hube of the 14th Panzer Corps and General Seydlitz-Kürzbach commanding the 51st Corps, believed that a determined breakout attempt in those first days had a genuine chance of success. Seydlitz-Kürzbach was particularly vociferous, eventually taking the extraordinary step of ordering his own corps to begin preparations for a breakout, directly contrary to Paulus's orders. Paulus countermanded the order and reported the matter to Army Group headquarters. Seydlitz-Kürzbach's insubordination was noted, but his analysis was not wrong. The window for a breakout existed, and it closed a little more with every passing day, as the Soviets reinforced their encirclement lines, and the 6th Army consumed its fuel and ammunition reserves, simply maintaining its positions. Paulus's defenders have pointed out, not unreasonably, that a breakout was genuinely more difficult than the critics acknowledged. The 6th Army, even in the first days of the encirclement, was not a fully mobile force that could simply pick up and march westward. Many of its divisions had suffered heavily in the fighting for Stalingrad and were at significantly reduced strength. Its logistics were already badly strained before the encirclement, and the breakout would have meant abandoning enormous quantities of heavy equipment, including artillery, that could not be moved without adequate fuel. Thousands of wounded soldiers would have had to be left behind, or transported under conditions that would have killed many of them. And a breakout westward through Soviet encirclement lines would have required sustained combat for perhaps 60 to 100 kilometers, fighting through Soviet formations that, while not yet fully consolidated, were nevertheless real and armed. It would have been a brutal, costly operation with uncertain chances of success. These arguments have merit, but they do not fully explain Paulus's passivity, because the alternative, remaining inside the pocket and waiting for relief that the military logic of the situation made essentially impossible, led with mathematical certainty to the destruction of the army. When choosing between a risky action with uncertain chances of success and a passive course of action leading to certain destruction, a commander with genuine independence of judgment should choose the risky action. Paulus could not make that choice because it required defying Hitler, and defying Hitler was something that Paulus, at the deepest level of his personality, was incapable of doing. The tragedy of Friedrich Paulus did not end with his surrender. His life in Soviet captivity would undergo a profound and, to some, surprising transformation. In the immediate aftermath of his capture, Paulus was treated relatively well by his Soviet captors, who recognized his enormous propaganda value and had no interest in allowing him to die in a prison camp. He was housed in comfortable quarters compared to the other prisoners, given adequate food, and subjected to intensive political education efforts by Soviet officers and German communist exiles who were determined to convert him from a German nationalist to an opponent of Nazism. For months, Paulus resisted. He maintained his position as a loyal German officer, refusing to participate in Soviet propaganda efforts, declining to sign statements condemning the Nazi regime. Then came the disaster of July 20th, 1944, when a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler and failed. The subsequent wave of executions and persecutions within the German officer corps, during which some of Paulus's former colleagues were hanged on piano wire in a Berlin prison, seems to have shaken him deeply. And perhaps, in the isolation of his captivity, having had months to reflect on the events that had led to the destruction of his army, Paulus began to arrive at different conclusions about the nature of the regime he had served. In August 1944, Paulus made a decisive public move. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners of war and communist exiles that sought to encourage German soldiers to surrender and undermine the Nazi regime. He began broadcasting anti-Nazi messages on Soviet radio. He signed appeals calling on German soldiers to lay down their arms. From the perspective of the German government, he had committed treason, and Hitler declared him a traitor, stripped him of his honours, and had his wife arrested and held under house arrest. From the perspective of history, Paulus's conversion raises genuinely complex questions. Was it sincere? Was it pragmatic calculation by a man who saw which way the war was going and wanted to secure good treatment for himself? Was it the genuine awakening of a conscience that had long been suppressed by military obedience? The question cannot be definitively answered. What is clear is that the change was real and lasting. After the war, Paulus would testify at Nuremberg against the German generals, providing evidence of the systematic crimes committed by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. He became an important witness for the prosecution, and his testimony helped to convict several of his former colleagues. Released from Soviet captivity in 1953, Paulus settled in Dresden in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany rather than in the Federal Republic of the West. Whether this was his choice or was effectively required by his Soviet hosts is uncertain, but it meant that he spent his final years in a communist state, a fact that did not endear him to many of his former military colleagues in the West, who had largely managed to rehabilitate themselves within the framework of the new German army, the Bundeswehr. Paulus died in Dresden on February 1st, 1957, just 4 days after the 14th anniversary of the German surrender at Stalingrad. He was 66 years old. He had lived long enough to see Germany rebuild, to see a German army formed again, to see his country divided by the very conflict in which he had played so central a role. He left behind memoirs that were published posthumously and a reputation that remains deeply contested. A man of great administrative talent who failed at the supreme test of military leadership, a soldier who could not find it within himself to defy the man who was destroying everything around him. The fate of General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who had so vocally advocated for a breakout and whose relationship with Paulus had become so strained during the Encirclement, provides an instructive contrast. After the surrender, Seydlitz-Kurzbach became one of the most energetic German prisoners to collaborate with the Soviets. He became a founding member of the League of German Officers, a sister organization to the National Committee for a Free Germany, and he threw himself into anti-Nazi activity with a passion that went considerably beyond anything that could be explained simply by pragmatic calculation. He wrote pamphlets, recorded broadcasts, and tried to organize German prisoners to resist the Nazi regime. He genuinely believed, or came to believe, that Germany could only be saved by overthrowing Hitler, and that the officers who had survived Stalingrad, having seen the consequences of following Hitler's orders to their logical conclusion, were uniquely positioned to make the case for resistance. The German government condemned him as a traitor just as it had condemned Paulus, and sentenced him to death in absentia for treason. After the war, Seydlitz-Kurzbach's situation became complicated by the divisions of the Cold War. He hoped to return to West Germany, but the Soviets were not ready to release him. In 1950, he was tried by a Soviet military tribunal on charges of war crimes, found guilty, and sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet prison camp, a sentence that many historians have viewed as the Soviet repayment for his wartime anti-Nazi activities being no longer necessary once the war was won. He remained in Soviet custody until 1955, when he was released as part of a general repatriation of German prisoners, following diplomatic negotiations between Bonn and Moscow. He returned to West Germany, where he found himself regarded with deep suspicion by many former military colleagues who viewed his wartime activities as treasonous, while simultaneously being unable to claim the status of a resistance hero because his collaboration had been with the Soviet Union, not with any Western-recognized opposition movement. He spent his remaining years attempting to clear his name, to have the death sentence imposed on him by the German wartime government legally annulled. He succeeded in this effort in 1956. Seydlitz-Kurzbach died in Bremen in 1976 at the age of 87, an ambiguous figure whose genuine opposition to Hitler was real, but whose methods and circumstances made him impossible to classify neatly as either hero or villain. No examination of the catastrophe at Stalingrad can ignore the role of General Franz Halder, who served as chief of the German Army General Staff from 1938 until his dismissal by Hitler in September 1942. Halder was one of the most intellectually gifted officers in the German military, a Bavarian Catholic with a deep commitment to the professional standards of the German General Staff tradition. He had been involved in the early years of the war in at least one tentative conspiracy against Hitler, though he had never committed to action. Throughout 1941 and 1942, his diaries, which he kept with remarkable candour and which survived the war hidden in a tin buried in his garden, record his growing horror at Hitler's increasingly erratic strategic decisions. His entry for July 23, 1942, the day Hitler issued Directive No. 45 and split Army Group South, reads with quiet desperation. He notes that Hitler is pursuing objectives simultaneously that would have been appropriate for pursuit sequentially, and that the result will be a dispersal of force that no individual objective will receive the strength needed to achieve it. He was correct. But Halder was a staff officer, not a field commander, and his ability to translate his correct understanding of the strategic situation into decisive action was limited both by the structure of the German command system and by his own personality. Hitler dismissed Halder in September 1942, replacing him with General Kurt Zeitzler, a more pliant officer who Hitler believed would be less argumentative and more supportive of his strategic vision. The dismissal of Halder removed from the German High Command the last senior officer who was both intellectually capable of understanding the true strategic situation and willing to argue against Hitler's decisions. After his dismissal, Halder was kept under surveillance by the Gestapo, and after the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, he was arrested on suspicion of involvement, though his role had been minimal. He was imprisoned in the Dachau concentration camp, surviving the war by a narrow margin, and was liberated by American forces in May 1945. He subsequently cooperated extensively with American military historians, providing detailed assessments of German operational planning and the role of Hitler's interference in military decisions. He died in Bavaria in 1972 at the age of 87, his memoirs and his diaries providing an invaluable window into the inner workings of the German High Command during the war's most critical phases. The question of what role the professional German military leadership played in the Stalingrad catastrophe is one that military historians have debated intensely. On one level, the disaster was clearly Hitler's fault. It was Hitler who divided Army Group South and pursued two objectives simultaneously. It was Hitler who ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad at all costs, rather than break out when breakout was possible. It was Hitler who accepted Göring's impossible promise of an air supply operation. It was Hitler who promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on the eve of surrender in an obvious attempt to influence him towards suicide rather than capitulation. All of these decisions bear Hitler's personal responsibility. But the German generals were not simply passive instruments of a dictatorial will. They participated in the planning of the campaign. They implemented the orders they received without, in most cases, effective resistance. They failed to develop the institutional mechanisms, the courage, the capacity for collective action that might have allowed them to constrain or override Hitler's worst decisions. The German officer corps had created, through its culture of obedience and its political decisions in the early years of the Nazi regime, precisely the conditions under which Hitler's catastrophic judgment could exercise itself without effective check. Stalingrad was the price of that abdication. But we must also ask why the German intelligence services, both military intelligence, the Abwehr, and the High Command's own intelligence sections, failed so completely to warn of what was coming. The Soviet build-up for Operation Uranus was not a perfect secret. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed increased activity behind Soviet lines. Radio intercepts provided hints of unusual movements. Prisoner interrogations and defector reports mentioned concentrations of tanks and artillery in areas away from Stalingrad. This information reached German intelligence analysts, some of whom produced assessments warning that a large Soviet offensive was likely. But those assessments were filtered through a systematic institutional bias that had pervaded German intelligence work since the beginning of the Russian campaign. German analysts consistently underestimated the Soviet Union's ability to produce and field military equipment, to train and organize new formations, and to maintain strategic secrecy. The official German estimate of Soviet tank production in 1942 was roughly 1,200 vehicles per year. The actual figure was more than 24,000. This extraordinary gap between perception and reality meant that German planners genuinely believed the Soviets could not mount the kind of massed armoured operation that Uranus turned out to be. When intelligence pointing toward exactly that kind of operation arrived on their desks, they dismissed or downplayed it because it did not fit their model of what the Soviet Union was capable of. In intelligence, as in so many other dimensions of the Stalingrad catastrophe, the Germans suffered from a fundamental failure of understanding, an inability to see the enemy as he actually was, rather than as they wished him to be. The Soviets, for their part, executed the build-up for Uranus with a level of operational security that was genuinely remarkable and reflected lessons painfully learned from the disasters of 1941. Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky, coordinating the planning from Moscow, imposed strict information compartmentalization. Only a handful of senior officers were briefed on the full scope of the operation. Troop movements were conducted at night. Radio silence was enforced with iron discipline. Artillery and armoured units were moved to their assembly areas through elaborate deception measures. Even the Soviet soldiers who would execute the attack were not told the full scope of what they were participating in until shortly before the offensive began. This stands in sharp contrast to German operational security, which the Soviets had learned to penetrate through a combination of signals, intelligence, partisan activity, and a network of informers. The degree to which Soviet intelligence services had penetrated the German command structure at various levels during the Stalingrad campaign remains only partially revealed even today, as Russian archives from this period are still not fully accessible to outside historians. But what is clear is that Zhukov and his colleagues had a far more accurate picture of German capabilities and intentions than German intelligence had of Soviet ones. It is worth pausing to consider the role that the battle's outcome had on subsequent events, not just in the war, but in the broader sweep of modern history, because to understand why Stalingrad mattered so much, why it was not simply a large battle, but a world historical event, is to understand the full weight of the decisions that led to it. When the Sixth Army surrendered on February 2, 1943, the political and psychological impact in Germany was unlike anything the Nazi regime had previously experienced. Germany had suffered military setbacks before. The Battle of Britain had been a failure. The Crusader offensive had driven Rommel back in North Africa. The winter crisis of 1941 had shaken the confidence of many. But the scale of the Stalingrad defeat was simply different. 300,000 men, the equivalent of the entire population of a medium-sized German city, had been encircled, destroyed, and taken prisoner. The defeat was so enormous, so total, so complete, that not even Goebbels's formidable propaganda apparatus could fully disguise its significance. 3 days of national mourning were declared. All entertainment programming was suspended. The German public, for the first time in significant numbers, began to seriously question whether Hitler was leading them to victory or to destruction. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was a moment of transformation. The Red Army had proven, beyond any further doubt, that it could not only resist the Germans, but defeat them, encircle them, destroy them in the kind of massive operational maneuver that the Germans themselves had previously considered their exclusive preserve. The confidence that flowed from Stalingrad would propel Soviet military planning and execution to ever greater achievements. Kursk in July 1943, the 10 Stalin offensive strikes of 1944, the final drive to Berlin in 1945. The soldiers who had survived Stalingrad, on both sides, knew that something fundamental had changed. The German army was not invincible. It could be defeated, it could be encircled and destroyed. And the Soviet Union, despite its staggering losses, had the industrial capacity, the manpower, and now the operational capability to keep pushing until the enemy was utterly broken. What of the broader strategic picture? Germany's failure at Stalingrad did not just destroy the Sixth Army, it destroyed the possibility of capturing the Caucasus oil fields, which had been the original strategic rationale for the entire 1942 offensive. Army Group A, having driven deep into the Caucasus toward Baku, now found itself threatened with encirclement, as the Soviet advances following Uranus and Little Saturn created a dangerous situation along its supply lines. It was forced to conduct a long fighting withdrawal that consumed enormous resources and achieved none of its objectives. The oil fields of Baku, which Germany had counted on to fuel its war machine through 1943 and beyond, remained in Soviet hands. This meant that Germany's fundamental strategic position, which required the capture of new oil sources to sustain operations at the scale the war demanded, was now essentially hopeless. The failure at Stalingrad was not just a tactical or operational defeat, it was the moment when Germany's strategic situation became irreversible. From November 1942 onward, Germany could not win the war. It could only delay losing it. The physical destruction visited upon Stalingrad during the battle was almost beyond comprehension, a city that had been home to more than 500,000 people before the war was reduced, in the months of fighting, to a landscape of rubble and ash. The great factory complexes that had given the city its industrial character, the tractor factory, the Barricadi plant, the Red October steelworks, were shattered shells. The residential districts, the schools, the hospitals, the theatres, the hotels, the department stores were simply gone, replaced by undulating mountains of broken masonry, twisted steel and the detritus of battle, shell casings, abandoned vehicles, the personal possessions of hundreds of thousands of people who had fled or died. The Volga itself was choked with wreckage. Even the geography of the city had been altered, the bulkers and gullies reshaped by explosions, the landmarks by which one had navigated before the war obliterated. Writers and correspondents who visited Stalingrad in the days after the fighting ended described an apocalyptic silence, punctuated only by the sound of wind through the ruins and the distant rumble of artillery still echoing from other fronts. It was, one Soviet journalist wrote, as if the city itself had died and only its bones remained. The rebuilding of Stalingrad would take years, and the city itself would be renamed. In 1961, as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, the city was renamed Volgograd, the city of the Volga, and that is the name it bears today. But in the memory of those who fought there, Russian and German alike, it remains Stalingrad. The name carries a weight of history that no bureaucratic renaming can erase. It is the name associated with the turning of the tide with the frozen hell of the Russian winter of 1942 to 1943, with 250,000 German soldiers who set out to capture a city and never came home. It is a name that, more than any other from the entire sweep of the Second World War, encapsulates the relationship between human decision-making and human catastrophe, between the grandiose ambitions of dictators and the suffering of ordinary men and women caught in the machinery of those ambitions. Beyond the grand strategic narrative, the Battle of Stalingrad was also a story of individual human beings placed under pressures that most people today cannot begin to imagine, and examining the experiences of those individuals provides a depth of understanding that operational history alone cannot supply. Let us look more closely at some of the commanders and figures whose stories have not yet been fully told, because in their lives and choices we find both the texture of the catastrophe and its human meaning. Consider General Hans Valentin Huber, commander of the 14th Panzer Corps inside the Stalingrad pocket. Huber was a remarkable man in several respects, not least because he had lost his right arm in combat during the First World War, and had nonetheless risen to a position of significant command in the next conflict. He was a physically tough, intellectually sharp commander, and he was among the most vocal advocates for a breakout from the Encirclement in the days immediately following the Soviet encirclement in November 1942. Hube argued, persuasively and correctly, that the window for a successful breakout was closing with every passing day, and that the army needed to act immediately if it was to have any chance of fighting its way out. His arguments went unheeded. When the decision was made to fly Hube out of the pocket in January 1943, ostensibly to report to Hitler on conditions inside and to help organize the relief operation, some of his comrades suspected that the real reason was to preserve a commander who was genuinely valuable and could not be replaced. Huber himself felt profoundly ambivalent about leaving his men, and he carried the weight of that ambivalence throughout the remainder of his career. After Stalingrad, he commanded the 1st Panzer Army in Italy and later in the Soviet Union with considerable skill, conducting a number of difficult defensive battles with great effectiveness. He was killed in an air crash in April 1944, just days after Hitler had promoted him to Colonel General, before he could testify fully about his experience at Stalingrad or the decisions that had led to it. His death removed from the historical record a voice that would have been invaluable in understanding the command dynamics inside the pocket. The role of the Luftwaffe in the Stalingrad catastrophe deserves more extended examination than the simple narrative of Goering's broken promise can provide. The men who actually flew the airlift missions, the pilots and crews of the transport squadrons, faced conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty. The distances from the main Luftwaffe bases to the pockets airfields were enormous, ranging from 200 to over 300 kilometers, depending on which base was used. The aircraft available, primarily the Junkers Ju-52, were essentially civilian airliners pressed into military transport service, designed for operation in temperate European conditions and wholly unsuited to the Russian winter. Ground crews worked in temperatures that could drop below -40 degrees Celsius to service aircraft that were never designed to operate in such conditions. Engine oils congealed, hydraulic systems froze, the rubber seals in fuel and oil lines contracted and cracked. Aircraft that started every morning flight in questionable condition frequently broke down before reaching the pocket, forcing pilots to abort and return to base, or in the worst cases, to crash land on the open steppe where the crew might freeze to death before rescue reached them. The Soviet air defenses, both fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery, were a constant and lethal threat. Soviet commanders understood perfectly well that the airlift was the only thread by which the Sixth Army's survival was suspended, and they devoted significant resources to cutting that thread. Soviet fighters intercepted the slow, vulnerable transport aircraft on every flight, and anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pockets airfields, making the final approach and landing the most dangerous phase of every mission. German fighter escorts were available, but inadequate in number and range, and on many days weather conditions made escort impossible. The losses among transport crews were horrifying. By the time the airlift effectively ended in January 1943 with the loss of the pockets airfields, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 500 aircraft and over 1,000 aircrew killed or missing in the airlift operation alone. These losses, added to the ongoing losses from combat operations throughout the Eastern Front, represented a permanent degradation of Luftwaffe capability that would affect German air power for the remainder of the war. General Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding the 4th Air Fleet responsible for Luftwaffe operations in the Stalingrad area, was deeply aware of the airlift's impossibility from the outset. Unlike Göring, who was far from the operational reality and motivated by personal political considerations, Richthofen was in direct contact with the operational facts. He knew how many aircraft he had, what their serviceability rates were in the Russian winter, what the flying distances were, and what Soviet defences would mean for loss rates. His diary entries from the period of the airlift are anguished documents, recording his frustration at being asked to perform a task that he knew was impossible, and his grief at the losses suffered by his crews in the attempt. Richthofen was a cousin of the famous World War I ace Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and he had built his own distinguished career in the Luftwaffe, having commanded the Condor Legion in Spain and played a significant role in the early campaigns of World War II. He was not a man given to underestimating difficulties or making impossible promises. His assessments of the airlift situation were accurate and grim, and they were systematically ignored by Göring and by Hitler, who preferred the comfortable fiction of an effective airlift to the uncomfortable reality of a trapped and starving army. Richthofen eventually suffered a brain tumour that ended his active service in late 1944. Dying in July 1945 spared at least the post-war reckoning that awaited many of his colleagues. The story of the Romanian armies that bore the initial assault of Operation Uranus is one of the least examined and least celebrated aspects of the Stalingrad campaign, and it deserves careful attention. Romania had entered the war on Germany's side in June 1941, motivated partly by territorial ambitions, specifically the recovery of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from the Soviet Union, and partly by the reality that a small country bordering Nazi Germany had very limited options for remaining neutral once the German offensive began. Romanian soldiers fought in the invasion of the Soviet Union from the start, participating in the capture of Odessa and the initial advances into the Caucasus. By 1942, Romania had contributed more than 300,000 soldiers to the Eastern Front, a significant proportion of its total military manpower. These soldiers were brave, many of them, and they died in enormous numbers, but they were equipped with weapons and equipment that dated from the previous decade or earlier, and their anti-tank capabilities were wholly inadequate for the armoured warfare that the Eastern Front demanded. General Petre Dumitrescu of the Romanian Third Army had been pleading for months before November 1942 for his forces to be provided with adequate anti-tank weapons, for mobile reserves to be positioned behind his line, and for the most obviously vulnerable sectors of his front to be reinforced. The German response was essentially to acknowledge the problem while doing almost nothing about it. The few German anti-tank units that were eventually placed in support of the Romanian position were wholly insufficient for the scale of the Soviet attack. When the 3,000 guns of the Soviet Don Front opened fire at dawn on November 19th, the Romanian soldiers in the forward positions had no practical ability to withstand what was coming. They fought, many of them with the weapons and courage they had, but against Soviet tank formations they were essentially defenseless. The Romanian Third Army lost approximately 150,000 men, killed, wounded or captured, in the initial Soviet breakthrough and its aftermath. The survivors who managed to retreat were often intercepted by German military police, demanding to know their units and orders, as if the collapse of an entire army could be managed through normal military administrative procedures. The relationship between Germany and its allied armies on the Eastern Front was deeply troubled throughout the war, and this troubled relationship was itself one of the systemic factors that made catastrophes like Stalingrad possible. German commanders routinely treated their allied contingents as inferior forces, as fillers for dangerous sectors that German troops were too valuable to waste on, as instruments of German strategic purpose whose own losses and needs were secondary to German operational requirements. This attitude, combined with a consistent failure to provide Allied forces with the weapons and equipment they needed, ensured that those forces were precisely as vulnerable as critics like Dumitrescu feared they would be. And yet, the entire German operational plan for Fall Blau depended on these vulnerable Allied forces, holding enormous stretches of front, while German armour concentrated for the advance on Stalingrad. It was a dependency that any honest strategic assessment would have identified as catastrophically fragile. The fact that no such honest assessment was produced, or that such assessments as were produced were ignored, speaks volumes about the epistemic environment in which German strategic planning operated in 1942. The battle inside the city of Stalingrad produced individual acts of military distinction on both sides that deserve to be remembered, alongside the strategic analysis. Among the Soviet defenders, no figure became more celebrated than Vasily Zaitsev, a sniper from the Ural Mountains who reportedly killed more than 240 German soldiers during the battle, and who became a Soviet propaganda phenomenon, celebrated in newspapers and radio broadcasts as a symbol of Soviet resistance. Zaitsev was not simply a propagandistic fiction, he was a genuinely skilled marksman who had grown up hunting in the Ural forests and who applied those hunting skills to the urban battlefield with devastating effectiveness. He also became a teacher, training other snipers in the techniques of concealment and target selection that made effective sniping possible in the ruins of Stalingrad. His activities, and those of the hundreds of Soviet snipers he helped to train, had a psychological effect on German soldiers that went beyond the actual casualties they inflicted. German soldiers at Stalingrad learned to fear any movement in the open, to move only at night or through covered routes, to understand that a momentary exposure of the head above a parapet could mean instant death from a marksman whose position they could not detect. This constant, unseen threat degraded morale and restricted movement in ways that the casualty statistics from sniping alone do not capture. On the German side, the fighting in the city produced its own heroes and its own stories of extraordinary endurance. The sappers, engineers and infantry units that fought their way through the factory districts of northern Stalingrad in October and November of 1942 performed feats of physical and moral courage that are recorded in unit histories and personal memoirs with a combination of pride and horror. The tractor factory, which produced T-34 tanks for the Soviet war effort right up until German forces were fighting in its workshops, was the site of some of the most intense combat of the entire war. German soldiers who entered the factory complex described a world of giant machinery, catwalks, furnaces and rubble-strewn floors, where combat was conducted in 3 dimensions simultaneously, with Soviet defenders on floors above and below the attacking German units, connected by holes blown through ceilings and floors. Every room was a potential ambush. Every piece of machinery could conceal a defender. The clearing of a single factory building might take days and cost hundreds of men on both sides. And when the battle for Stalingrad was over, when the pocket collapsed and the Sixth Army surrendered, these men who had fought so hard for buildings that now had no military value whatsoever faced the prospect of the Soviet prisoner of war camps, and most of them would never return. The question of why so few of the approximately 90,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad ever returned to Germany is one that has been extensively studied and remains deeply disturbing. The immediate causes were multiple. Many of the prisoners were already in catastrophic physical condition when they surrendered, weakened by weeks of malnutrition and cold, suffering from wounds that had not been properly treated, afflicted with frostbite, dysentery and other diseases of the degraded conditions inside the pocket. These men died in large numbers almost immediately after capture, simply because they were too weak to survive the marches and the transport conditions of the Soviet prisoner collection system. The marches from the Stalingrad area to the collection points and prisoner of war camps were brutal for men in any state of health, and for men in the condition of the Stalingrad prisoners, they were death marches in everything but name. Soviet guards, whose own supplies and logistics were under severe strain from years of war, often had little to offer the prisoners in terms of food or shelter, and in some cases the ideological equation of German soldier with fascist murderer led to deliberate brutality. The camps to which the survivors were eventually transported were themselves harsh environments. The Soviet prisoner of war system, like the German prisoner of war system for Soviet captives, was not designed with the welfare of its inmates as a primary consideration. Mortality rates in Soviet camps holding German prisoners, particularly in the first 2 years after Stalingrad, were extraordinarily high. Disease, malnutrition, inadequate shelter, brutal physical conditions, and sometimes direct violence carried off tens of thousands of men who had survived the encirclement itself. By some estimates, as many as 45,000 of the 90,000 Stalingrad prisoners died within the first year of captivity. The remaining 45,000 were distributed among various prison camps across the Soviet Union, many being used as forced labor in mines, factories, and construction projects that were themselves dangerous environments. The process of repatriation to Germany, which began in 1946 for the least valuable prisoners and dragged on until 1955 for the last survivors, allowed only the fraction of Stalingrad prisoners who had survived the entire decade-long ordeal to return home. When the last men came, back in 1955 they returned to a Germany that had rebuilt itself in the decade since the war's end, to families that had in many cases given them up for dead and made new arrangements for their lives. The homecomings, described in memoirs by returned prisoners, were frequently bittersweet, reunions with strangers after an absence measured in a decade of suffering. The broader lesson that military historians have drawn from the Stalingrad campaign about the nature of urban warfare is one that has proven relevant in conflicts far removed in time and geography from the ruins of the city on the Volga. The fundamental insight that Chuikov grasped and applied so effectively that a superior force's advantages in firepower and maneuver can be neutralized by pressing combat to such close ranges that those advantages become liabilities has been rediscovered and applied in cities from Hue to Grozny to Fallujah to Mosul. The specific tactics of the storm groups, the hugging of enemy lines, the three-dimensional use of building interiors, the exploitation of rubble and debris as defensive positions, these approaches have appeared in various forms in virtually every major urban battle since Stalingrad. The Russian military itself has studied the battle intensively, both as a source of operational pride and as a tactical laboratory, and the lessons derived from it have informed Soviet and Russian military doctrine for 8 decades. In a grim sense, Stalingrad's most enduring legacy may be the transformation of modern military thinking about urban warfare, a transformation that has made subsequent urban battles somewhat less disastrously expensive for defenders, though still extraordinarily costly for all concerned. The strategic context in which the Battle of Stalingrad occurred is worth one final consideration, because without it, the full dimensions of the catastrophe cannot be understood. By the summer of 1942, Germany was fighting on 3 major fronts simultaneously: in the Soviet Union, in North Africa, and in the air over Western Europe and the Atlantic. Its industrial base, impressive by the standards of the early war years but inadequate for the demands of truly global industrial warfare, was straining to produce enough equipment and weapons for these multiple commitments. Its manpower, which had always been one of the limiting factors in German strategic planning given the country's modest population compared to the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, was being consumed at rates that conscription could not fully replace. The losses of the 1941 Soviet campaign had been extraordinarily heavy. The replacement system was providing men, but the quality of training and equipment that new formations received was declining as the supply of experienced veterans thinned. The German army that fought at Stalingrad in 1942 was not the same instrument, in terms of its human quality at every level, that had swept through France in 1940, or driven to the gates of Moscow in 1941. It was still formidable, still capable of extraordinary feats of arms, still possessed of an institutional culture of tactical excellence that made it a dangerous opponent at every level of combat. But it was not capable of winning a war against an enemy with the Soviet Union's combination of strategic depth, industrial capacity, and human reserves. And Stalingrad was the moment when this fundamental arithmetic became undeniable. The German public's experience of Stalingrad provides yet another dimension to the catastrophe. Throughout the months of the Encirclement, the Nazi propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels maintained a relentlessly optimistic public narrative. The Sixth Army was holding its positions heroically. Relief was on the way. The Führer had not forgotten his soldiers. These messages were broadcast on radio, printed in newspapers, spoken from pulpits by clergymen who had been recruited into the propaganda effort. Families of soldiers known to be inside the pocket received official reassurances that were systematically misleading about the true situation. Some families received letters from their loved ones inside the pocket that, because of censorship and soldiers' natural desire to protect their families from despair, were more optimistic than the reality warranted. When the disaster finally became undeniable, when the German state announced the defeat and declared 3 days of national mourning, the reaction among the German public was complex. There was grief, naturally, on an enormous scale. There was shock at the gap between what they had been told and what had evidently happened. And there was, for the first time in significant numbers, genuine doubt. Doubt about the Führer's judgment, doubt about the war's outcome, doubt about the entire project of National Socialist conquest that had seemed so triumphant just a few years before. Goebbels' diaries from February 1943 record his anxiety about public morale with unusual candour. He understood that Stalingrad had damaged something in the relationship between the German people and their leader that propaganda alone could not repair. He attempted, with his famous speech at the Berlin Sportpalast in February 1943, to transform the defeat into a rallying cry, to reframe the catastrophe as a demand for total war, a summons to even greater sacrifice and determination. The response he received from the carefully selected crowd in the Sportpalast was enthusiastic, but the wider public mood was darker and more uncertain than the cheering crowd suggested. The German military's failure at Stalingrad accelerated a process that had been underway since the failure at Moscow in December 1941. The progressive erosion of Hitler's authority as a military commander in the eyes of those professional soldiers who had initially accepted his interference with varying degrees of tolerance. After Stalingrad, the whispered conversations among senior German officers about Hitler's strategic incompetence grew louder and more widespread. The conspiracy that would eventually attempt to assassinate Hitler in July 1944 drew many of its participants from the pool of officers who had served on the Eastern Front and had watched the consequences of Hitler's military decisions firsthand. General Friedrich Olbricht, one of the key plotters, had served in positions that gave him direct visibility into the decision-making process around the Stalingrad campaign. General Henning von Treschow, perhaps the most determined and consistent of all the conspirators, had served on Army Group Center throughout the Eastern Front campaign, and had drawn from his experiences the conclusion that Hitler had to be killed if Germany was to survive. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who placed the bomb under Hitler's conference table on July 20, 1944, had been severely wounded in North Africa in 1943, losing an eye, a hand and 2 fingers on his remaining hand, and had returned to staff duty in Berlin, where his access to the strategic picture had convinced him that the war was being led toward national catastrophe. These men, and the other conspirators of the July 20th plot, were motivated by many things: patriotism, personal honour, Christian conscience, professional military judgment. But Stalingrad and its lessons were part of the context in which their determination to act was formed. The July 20th plot failed, and most of the conspirators were executed in the weeks that followed, many of them hanged on piano wire in Plötzensee prison in a deliberate act of humiliation that Hitler insisted on filming for his personal viewing. Among those who died was Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who had been designated to become Supreme Commander of the German Armed Forces if the coup had succeeded. Also executed was General Erich Hoepner, who had commanded armoured forces in both the Western Campaign and the early phase of Barbarossa, before being dismissed by Hitler in January 1942 for conducting an unauthorised tactical withdrawal to save his troops from encirclement. The execution of these officers, many of them among the most professionally accomplished commanders in the German military, removed from the army exactly those individuals who had been willing to act on their independent judgment against Hitler's will, leaving behind precisely those who would not. The irony is tragic. The men who might have saved Germany from the full consequences of Hitler's decisions were killed for daring to try, and their deaths ensured that the machinery of catastrophe would continue to operate until the end. To fully understand why the Battle of Stalingrad was doomed from the start, we must examine not just the broad sweep of strategic decisions, but also the specific chain of individual moments when the fate of the Sixth Army was irreversibly sealed. There were, by the most careful analysis, at least 5 distinct points at which a different decision, made by a different person with greater independence of judgment, could have changed the outcome. Understanding these moments and why the right choices were not made tells us everything we need to know about the systemic failures that made Stalingrad inevitable. The first fatal moment came with Directive No. 45, issued July 23, 1942, when Hitler simultaneously split his offensive forces and elevated the capture of Stalingrad from a secondary operational objective to a primary one. This decision violated the most fundamental principle of strategy: concentration of force. A German army general staff that was genuinely capable of restraining Hitler's worst strategic impulses would have refused to implement this directive, or would have found ways to effectively neutralize it. But by the summer of 1942, the German military command had been so thoroughly subordinated to Hitler's personal control that no such institutional resistance was possible. Halder protested, in private, in his diary. He could not make his protests effective. The lesson here is institutional. When a military command structure becomes so thoroughly personalized around a single leader that professional military judgment cannot exercise itself, catastrophic decisions become not merely possible but inevitable. The second fatal moment came in the last days of November 1942, when a breakout from the newly formed encirclement was still possible. Here the failure was Paulus's, but it was also the failure of the entire system that had produced Paulus. A commander who lacked the will and the authorization to act independently, combined with a Hitler who demanded the army hold its position, combined with a Göring who made an impossible promise about the airlift. These 3 factors locked together to seal the army inside the pocket at precisely the moment when escape was most feasible. Had Paulus been a different kind of man, one willing to act on his own judgment, as generals are supposed to be able to do in crisis situations, he might have ordered a breakout on November 24th or 25th when the Soviet ring was thinnest. The breakout might have failed. Many men would certainly have died in the attempt, but some portion of the army might have escaped, and the catastrophic totality of the defeat might have been avoided. The third fatal moment came with Göring's airlift promise on November 24th. Göring knew, or should have known, that he was committing the Luftwaffe to an impossible task. His own staff officers told him so, explicitly and immediately. Had Göring been honest with Hitler about the Luftwaffe's capabilities, Hitler would have been forced to confront the impossibility of simply waiting for the airlift to sustain the army. He might, under those circumstances, have ordered a breakout while one was still possible. Instead, the promise of the airlift provided exactly the justification Hitler needed for his hold-at-all-costs order, and the army remained trapped inside the pocket, consuming its reserves while waiting for a supply that could never arrive in adequate quantities. The fourth fatal moment came in mid-December, when Manstein's winter storm relief operation had driven to within 50 kilometers of the pocket. Here the failure was again shared between Hitler and Paulus, with Manstein as a tragic witness. Manstein understood that the relief force could not break all the way into the city, that it needed Paulus to break out and meet it halfway. He communicated this understanding to Paulus as clearly as he could within the constraints of military communication, but Paulus would not move without Hitler's authorization, and Hitler would not give it. Some historians have argued that Manstein himself shares responsibility for this failure, that he could and should have sent Paulus a more direct and unambiguous order to break out, using his authority as army group commander to override Hitler's prohibition. Manstein's Defenders argue that any such order would immediately have been countermanded by Hitler and that Manstein's own position would have been imperiled without achieving anything. It is a genuine dilemma, and the argument has not been resolved in the historical literature. What is beyond dispute is that the opportunity passed, the window closed, and after December 23rd, when the Soviets launched Little Saturn and Manstein's forces were compelled to withdraw from the Mishkova River, there was no further realistic prospect of relief. The fifth fatal moment, if one less dramatic than the others, came throughout the weeks of the Encirclement when German intelligence and the High Command consistently failed to develop accurate assessments of Soviet strength and intention. Had German planners understood the scale of what the Soviets were preparing in October and November 1942, they might have taken more effective action to reinforce the vulnerable flanks, to position mobile reserves, to prepare. The kind of defensive framework that might have blunted, or at least significantly disrupted, Operation Uranus. Instead, systematically underestimating Soviet capabilities as they had done since 1941, they left the Romanian and Italian armies to hold positions that could not be held. This intelligence failure was not accidental. It was the product of a systematic ideological contempt for Soviet military capacity that pervaded German thinking at the highest levels, a contempt that the events of 1941 and 1942 had done very little to correct. Let us now look at what became of some of the other key German commanders whose decisions shaped the Stalingrad catastrophe, because their post-war fates illuminate the broader question of accountability and justice that the battle raises. We begin with Erich von Manstein, the man who came closest to saving the Sixth Army and who spent much of his post-war life arguing that the blame for Stalingrad lay exclusively with Hitler and not with the Professional Officer Corps. Manstein was captured by British forces in May 1945 and held for several years while war crimes charges were considered. In 1949, he was tried by a British military court in Hamburg on charges relating to war crimes committed by forces under his command on the Eastern Front. He was accused of issuing orders that resulted in civilian deaths, of failing to prevent his forces from participating in the murderous activities of SS Einsatzgruppen, operating in his rear areas, and of ordering the shooting of prisoners of war. Manstein contested the charges vigorously, presenting himself as a professional soldier who had been unaware of or unable to prevent the crimes committed in his operational area. The defense was, at best, partially credible. Documents introduced at trial demonstrated that Manstein had received reports of Einsatzgruppen activities and had not acted to prevent or stop them. He was found guilty on 9 of the 17 charges and sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. The sentence was almost immediately controversial. Winston Churchill, who was no longer Prime Minister but remained an enormously influential voice in British politics, contributed to a fund for Manstein's legal defence and spoke publicly in his favour, arguing that Manstein was a professional soldier who should be distinguished from Nazi war criminals. The British establishment, partly motivated by the Cold War logic of building West Germany as a strong ally against the Soviet Union, was receptive to these arguments. Manstein's sentence was reduced on appeal to 12 years, and he was actually released from prison in May 1953, after serving less than 4 years, his release attributed, as was so often the case with German officers of his generation, to declining health. He was 56 years old at his release, and his health recovered sufficiently for him to live for another 20 years. In the 1950s, he served as an unofficial advisor to West Germany's government as it built the Bundeswehr, the new West German armed forces that were being created as part of the NATO alliance structure. He published his memoirs titled Verlorenes Siege, or Lost Victories, in 1955, and the book became enormously influential, not least because it was written with genuine literary skill and presented Manstein's role in the war in the most favourable possible light. The memoirs argued, consistently and persuasively, that the German army's professionals had been repeatedly let down by Hitler's amateur interference in military decisions, and that the professionals themselves bore minimal responsibility for the war's catastrophic outcomes. This argument, sometimes called the clean Wehrmacht myth, would dominate public understanding of the German military's role in the Second World War for decades, until a new generation of German historians, working with previously inaccessible archival materials, began in the 1990s to systematically demonstrate the degree to which the regular German army had participated in, facilitated, and often directly executed the genocidal policies of the Nazi regime. The Wehrmacht Crimes Exhibition, which toured Germany in the late 1990s, caused enormous public controversy by presenting evidence that the regular army, not just the SS, had participated in the murder of Jewish civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, and others classified as enemies of the Reich. Manstein died in June 1973 at the age of 85, having lived long enough to see the beginning of this historical reassessment, but not its full development. His reputation has been revised considerably since his death, and the lost victories narrative that he presented in his memoirs is now viewed with considerably more skepticism than it was when the book was first published. Hermann Göring, whose reckless promise about the airlift was so central to the Sixth Army's destruction, survived the war to face judgment at Nuremberg. He was the highest-ranking surviving Nazi leader to be prosecuted, appearing before the International Military Tribunal as the primary defendant, and he made no attempt to minimize his role or claim ignorance. He was intellectually formidable in his defense, cross-examining witnesses with considerable skill and making arguments that occasionally troubled the prosecution. He was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. 2 hours before the execution was to take place, on October 15, 1946, Göring bit down on a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled to him. Sources differ on exactly how, and died instantly. He denied the court the spectacle of his execution and denied history the full answer to how he had obtained the poison. His role in the Stalingrad disaster, the promise that condemned 300,000 men, was only one item in an almost incomprehensibly long catalogue of crimes and failures, but it was perhaps one of the most consequential single acts of a man whose career was defined by consequential acts. Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the German Army General Staff who replaced Halder and who bore significant responsibility for the failures of the Stalingrad campaign, had a more complex post-war story. He had attempted, during the final catastrophic phases of the Eastern Front War in 1944, to persuade Hitler to allow strategic withdrawals, and when Hitler refused, Zeitzler suffered what appears to have been a genuine nervous collapse in July 1944, disappearing from his post and eventually being placed on the inactive list. After the war, he was held briefly by Allied forces but was not prosecuted, partly because his collapse in 1944 was interpreted as evidence that he had reached the limits of his ability to tolerate Hitler's decisions, and partly because his post-war statements cooperating with Allied military historians were judged to be sufficiently useful. He lived quietly in West Germany after the war, writing military history and historical assessments that provided Allied scholars with valuable information about German operational planning. He died in 1963. Arthur Schmidt, the Sixth Army's Chief of Staff who had so firmly opposed a breakout and had been, in the view of many, a significant force behind Paulus's passivity, spent many years in Soviet captivity. He was one of the last German prisoners of the Stalingrad battle to be repatriated, not returning to Germany until 1955, 12 years after the surrender. He had been subjected to intensive Soviet political indoctrination throughout his captivity, but had resisted it far more successfully than Paulus or Seydlitz-Kurzbach, maintaining his original political positions and refusing to make anti-Nazi statements or collaborate with Soviet propaganda. When he returned to Germany, he was regarded by conservative military circles as something of a hero, a man who had maintained his principles under enormous pressure. He wrote and spoke about his experiences, presenting a version of events that tended to minimize the mistakes of the Sixth Army's leadership, and to attribute the catastrophe primarily to Hitler's decisions. He died in 1987, having outlived most of the men who had served in the pocket. General Karl Strecker, who commanded the Northern Pocket that held out until February 2, 1943, 2 days after Paulus's surrender, was also held in Soviet captivity for many years. He had been the last German general to surrender at Stalingrad, and this fact, combined with his consistent refusal to collaborate with Soviet propaganda efforts, gave him a certain prestige among German military traditionalists after his return to Germany in 1955. He had sent a final radio message to Hitler on February 2nd, just before surrendering, informing him that the Northern Pocket was fighting to the last. The message was a final gesture of military pride in a situation where pride was perhaps the only thing left to the survivors. Strecker died in 1973. His story, like so many others connected with Stalingrad, illustrates the fundamental ambiguity of individual behavior in a situation of collective catastrophe. Men who showed considerable personal courage in some dimensions of the experience, while remaining complicit in the larger systems of command and obedience that had created the catastrophe in the first place. What of the Romanian commanders whose forces bore the initial brunt of Operation Uranus? General Petre Dumitrescu, commanding the Romanian Third Army, had done everything within his power to warn his German superiors of his forces' vulnerability to a Soviet armoured assault. His warnings were specific, detailed and accurate, and they were ignored. When the attack came and his army was overwhelmed, he managed to conduct a partial withdrawal that saved some of his forces from total destruction, but the damage was catastrophic. Regardless, Dumitrescu survived the war, eventually ending up in exile in the United States after the communist takeover of Romania in 1948 made it impossible for him to return to his homeland. The story of Dumitrescu illustrates another dimension of the Stalingrad catastrophe. The way in which Germany's treatment of its allies, its consistent subordination of their safety and interest to German tactical requirements, its refusal to provide them with adequate weapons and equipment, ultimately contributed to the disaster. The Romanian, Italian and Hungarian armies were not merely incidental participants in the campaign. They held critical sections of front, and their inadequacy, which German commanders knew about and accepted as an unavoidable given, was the door through which the Soviet operational plan walked to enclose and destroy the Sixth Army. The human cost of the Battle of Stalingrad was staggering on both sides, in ways that the strategic summaries and the lists of divisions and the operational maps cannot fully convey. Soviet casualties during the entire Stalingrad campaign, from the initial German attack in August 1942 through the final Soviet victory in February 1943, have been estimated at between 1 million and 1.1 million killed, wounded or captured. This figure is so large as to be almost incomprehensible. It is larger than the entire population of many modern European countries. It represents individual human lives, each one unique, each one connected to families and communities and futures that never came to pass. The Soviet 62nd Army, which bore the direct burden of the city's defense under Vasily Chuikov, effectively ceased to exist as an organized formation multiple times during the battle, having to be rebuilt with fresh replacements even while the fighting continued around it. Individual Soviet units experienced losses of 70, 80, 90% of their strength, sometimes within a matter of days, and were then reconstituted with new men thrown into the same furnace. The endurance required of Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad was not merely physical, it was psychological and moral, a demand to keep fighting in conditions of almost unimaginable horror, surrounded by death and destruction on a scale that shattered normal human comprehension. For the ordinary German soldier inside the Stalingrad pocket, the experience of the encirclement was a journey through stages of suffering that the survivors who lived to record their memories described in terms that seem almost literary in their darkness. There was initially something close to disbelief, then a grim determination. Then, as weeks passed without rescue and the rations shrank and the cold deepened, a gradual surrender of hope that was somehow accompanied, in many cases, by a strange clarity. Letters written by soldiers inside the pocket, collected by German postal censors and preserved in the archives, reveal men saying goodbye to their families, putting their affairs in order, coming to terms with the fact that they would not see Germany again. Some letters express anger at the leadership that had put them in this position. Others express a kind of resigned acceptance. Very few express self-pity. These were, by and large, men who had been trained from childhood to be stoic and obedient, and they applied those qualities to the business of dying just as they had applied them to the business of fighting. They deserve to be remembered as individuals, not merely as statistics. Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet commander who had defended the city so brilliantly, would go on to a long and distinguished career. He commanded the 62nd Army, later redesignated the 8th Guards Army, throughout the remaining years of the war, fighting from Stalingrad westward to Berlin. It was Chuikov's forces that reached the German capital first, and it was to Chuikov that the Berlin garrison commander came to discuss surrender in the final days of April 1945. He later served as commander-in-chief of the Soviet Army and deputy minister of defense. He wrote extensively about his experiences at Stalingrad in memoirs that, while naturally presenting his own role in the most favourable light, contain a wealth of operational detail and personal observation that has been invaluable to historians. He died in 1982 at the age of 81 and was buried, at his own request, on Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd, on the hill that had been so fiercely contested during the battle, where a massive memorial complex now stands. His grave is there today, on the hill where the steel and shrapnel are still thick in the earth, where the names of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are inscribed on the walls of the Hall of Military Glory. The memorial on Mamayev Kurgan, completed in 1967, is one of the most remarkable and affecting monuments to the Second World War anywhere in the world. At its centre stands a massive statue, one of the tallest in the world, at 85 metres from base to sword tip, of Mother Russia calling her children to battle. The figure's face is turned toward the west, toward the direction from which the enemy came, and her sword is raised in defiance. Around the base of the hill, the walls of the memorial complex are carved with the names of the fallen, so many names that the walls themselves become almost incapable of individual attention, the sheer mass of the record overwhelming the individual's capacity to comprehend it. Visitors from Russia, Germany, Romania and other countries come to Mamayev Kurgan every year. German veterans who survived the pocket made pilgrimages there in the decades after the war, standing on the hill and trying to reconcile the memorial landscape of the Soviet monument with their own memories of the same ground covered in snow and blood and rubble. The hill has become a place of convergence for different kinds of memory, different national narratives about what the battle meant and what price was paid for it. The question that this entire examination has been building toward is the one with which we began. Was the Battle of Stalingrad doomed from the start? The answer, having traced the decisions and the failures and the personalities and the circumstances from the summer of 1942 to the February of 1943, is a careful and qualified yes. The battle was not doomed in the sense of some iron mechanical inevitability, as if no different decision could have changed the outcome. At multiple points, as we have seen, different choices could have led to different results. A single German advance rather than a split offensive might have achieved the capture of Stalingrad without the catastrophic overextension. A breakout order issued in late November might have saved a portion of the Sixth Army. An honest assessment from Göring of the airlift's limitations might have forced Hitler to reconsider his hold-at-all-costs directive. A more independent-minded commander than Paulus might have broken out in December when Manstein's relief force was at the Mishkova River. Any one of these different decisions might have changed the specific outcome of this specific campaign. But the battle was doomed in a deeper sense. It was the product of a system, a political and military system, that had systematically disabled the mechanisms by which poor decisions are identified and corrected. Hitler's personal control over strategic planning meant that his obsessions, his errors, and his ideological biases could not be checked by professional military judgment. The culture of obedience within the German military, taken to such an extreme that senior commanders would not disobey even orders that they knew were leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of their own men, meant that the system lacked the internal corrective capacity that effective military organizations require. The systematic contempt for Soviet capabilities that pervaded German intelligence and planning meant that the enemy was never understood as he actually was. And the willingness of key individuals, Göring in particular, to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know, meant that the decision-making process was corrupted by exactly the kind of flattery and self-deception that destroys rational analysis. These were not accidental failures. They were structural features of the Nazi war-making system, and they would have produced catastrophic outcomes sooner or later regardless of the specific decisions made in July and November of 1942. Stalingrad was not merely a battle that was lost. It was the moment when the accumulated structural failures of the Nazi military system produced their most concentrated and most devastating consequence. And so we come to the final accounting. More than 250,000 German and Allied soldiers died in or as a result of the Stalingrad encirclement. The Soviet Union lost 1 million people, defending and then recapturing the city. A great industrial city was reduced to rubble and rebuilt over decades. The course of the world's most destructive war was fundamentally altered. 6 years of conflict, reaching from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma to the deserts of North Africa, were shaped in ways both direct and indirect by what happened on the banks of the Volga in the winter of 1942 to 1943. The men who made the decisions that led to Stalingrad, Hitler most of all, bore a responsibility for this human catastrophe that dwarfs almost anything else in the history of modern warfare. Some of them faced justice, partial and imperfect though it was. Others lived out their days in comfortable retirement, writing memoirs that shifted blame and minimized their own roles. Very few showed genuine remorse. The soldiers who died in the pocket, the Soviet soldiers who died defending it, the civilians who perished in the bombing and the fighting, they left behind nothing but memories and a few words scratched on paper in the cold of a Russian winter to the loved ones they knew they would never see again. They deserve to be remembered, and the decisions that killed them deserve to be understood, clearly and without illusion, for what they were. The product not of fate or bad luck, but of human choice, human failure, and human pride. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad stands as the supreme case study in what happens when military power is deployed in the service of ideology rather than strategy, when political prestige takes precedence over human lives, when the mechanisms designed to correct bad decisions are systematically disabled by the concentration of power in a single individual. It teaches that no army, however skilled and experienced, can overcome the consequences of strategic arrogance indefinitely. It teaches that the contempt for an enemy's capabilities, however satisfying to national pride, is militarily fatal. It teaches that the courage of individual soldiers, however extraordinary, cannot substitute for sound strategic leadership. And it teaches, above all, that the men who make the decisions that send other men to die bear a responsibility that does not diminish with time. That the names inscribed on the walls at Mamayev Kurgan are an accounting that remains permanently open. The Battle of Stalingrad was, in the fullest sense, doomed from the start, not by fate, but by the choices of the men who made it happen, and the choices of those who could have prevented it, but did not. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this deep dive into the Battle of Stalingrad has given you a new understanding of why this pivotal moment in history unfolded the way it did, and why the decisions made long before the first German soldier entered the ruins of the city on the Volga were already writing the ending of this terrible story. If you found this video informative and want to learn more about the commanders, the battles, and the extraordinary human stories of the Second World War, make sure to check out our other videos on the German generals who fought in this conflict and what became of them after the war's end. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to our channel for more World War II content, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next one.